All right, welcome to Office Hours, episode 10. I'm your host, editor-in-chief of the Pamphleteer, Davis Hunt. We got a good show ahead of us today. Today I'll be talking to Lafayette Lee. Lafayette Lee is a contributing editor to IM 1776, has a pretty influential Twitter account that has been invited to speak with repeatedly with Lee Smith of the Epic Times and a variety of other media figures. So I look forward to my conversation with him. We're going to be talking about immigration, which is a fun topic if you can keep your head about talking about it. For those of you that are unfamiliar, the Pamphleteer is a daily email newsletter. We're fashioned after the traditional alt-weekly model. We send out daily newsletters. You can sign up. I think I got to go like that to look at the link. You can sign up at our website. We cover Nashville, culture and politics, business, real estate development, etc. We also sprinkle in national commentary, a variety of things. It's, the ideal reader is someone who's curious about the developments in Middle Tennessee and Nashville and kind of wants to stay abreast of political developments there. Maybe lives there or is curious about the area in general. If you've looked at if you track the national media, you've seen that there have been quite a few stories written about Nashville and its relationship to the state of Tennessee or the state of Tennessee more broadly, usually in a negative light. And we have sought to address that and, speak positively about the state of Tennessee because it's doing a lot of good things that you will not read about. So that's what we do. If you're not signed up for our daily newsletter, go to our website and do that there. We send out entertaining emails. I think I'm pretty funny sometimes. All the other contributors are funny. We try to sprinkle in humor with the, kind of dryness of what Stanley Kubrick called the most boring pursuit in the world, local news. So with that, let's get started. What we do next is we look back at the previous week of Pamphleteer coverage. Let's see, what do we got here? First thing, this made national news. Okay, I'm not trying to claim credit here, but I did send out a tweet that got like 1.2 million views that had this story about the Romica family who is in Morristown. I put a little map. Morristown is in the northeast corner of Tennessee, northeast of Knoxville, in Appalachia, I suppose. This family of, I think they have 10 kids. Let's see, 8 to 10 kids. I can't remember the number. Sought asylum in the U.S. from Germany in 2008 because Germany was fining them for homeschooling their children. It's illegal to homeschool children in Germany, and so they moved to the U.S. where it's legal. They're evangelicals. I think they're Baptists, and I guess they couldn't find a school that aligned with their values in Germany, so they moved to the U.S., tried to do this, sought asylum. They were given an indefinite stay or a kind of delay on the decision in 2013. But 2 weeks ago, they were given notice that they had 4 weeks to get their German passports in preparation for deportation. And it's somewhat complicated because they've been here for 15 years. They have had 2 children since they moved here in the U.S. that are technically U.S. citizens I'm not sure the ramifications of birth. Not up on immigration policy like that. But they've had 2 kids here. 2 of their other children have married U.S. citizens. And it's a complicated story. It's one of those things that, in contrast to, and I'm going to get into this with Lafayette a little later, in contrast to all the other news we see about the border and this kind of thing, it sticks out for how unfairly they've been treated, for going through the correct and legal avenues to gain citizenship in the U.S. and being denied that so forcefully after such a long time being here, having clearly settled and ingratiated themselves as American citizens and represented, values that the nation purportedly wants to encourage, which is family creation, education, etc., civic responsibility. I imagine that this family checks off all those boxes. The obvious rejoinder is that they're getting singled out because they're white, and that most of the people coming over the border are not. Who's to say? The fact of the matter is they're a Christian family who sought asylum here And I understand that there's, in my tweet, guys from the Cato Institute, some other people, some strong advocates of immigration were in my replies trying to inform me of the intricacies of immigration law and what kind of standard this would set. And I guess I can humor those arguments if it didn't appear so stark in contrast to everything else we hear about immigration in this country. So that's happening. I don't know how this is going to play out. I think they've got a GoFundMe or a petition going around trying to get them to stay. I know that Marsha Blackburn has come out in support of them. Something to keep an eye on. Next up, Gabrielle Hansen. Gabrielle Hansen is running for mayor in Franklin, and it's a bit like a dog catching the car. Gabrielle's been this kind of inflammatory figure in Franklin politics, if you track any of that. She first came on the scene because she made up this conspiracy theory about why the Covenant massacre happened, saying that there was a love triangle or some other such thing. I mean, it was a theory pulled straight out of her ass and made no sense. And she was going around town talking about that. Time passes on. She wrote a threatening letter to the airport authority, threatening to, I think, disrupt their proceedings or some other such thing if they didn't give to this charity that she wanted them to give to. And more recently, in her mayoral campaign, she's done everything from put up fake photos of her supporters, which are actually just random people from Chicago that claim they don't know her, as part of her campaign materials. It's been revealed, if you run a background check on her, that she was charged in 1995 with 2 counts of promoting prostitution and 1 count of money laundering. More lately, there have been questions about where she lives. Does she stay in... her husband was running for Congress in Chicago back in 2021, and she's running for mayor. She's an alderman in Franklin. She's running for mayor in 2023. There have been serious questions brought up about where she actually lives. Let's see, what else? She claims that she warned the police before the Covenant shooting. News Channel 5's Phil Williams got the body cam footage from the time the police visited her house because she was getting death threats over her. I'm not sure what the circumstances were. But in the footage where she claimed she warned them of the shooting, she of course did not. Her husband wore an American flag Speedo at Chicago Pride in 2021, which kind of undermines her positioning as this, anti-LGBTQ influence candidate. The board, the Franklin Alderman's board was going to censure her or punish her for these things, and they ultimately decided not to because there's an election coming up on October 4th in a week. Early voting starts for mayor, and I think they're just hoping that she's going to get voted out. She's kind of one of those candidates that emerges into politics that makes you, she so unfit for office that I'm shocked she even made it this far. I'll say that. Next up, Justin Canoe. Justin Canoe and the Tennessee Holler got the cover treatment in the Nashville scene this week. Justin Canoe runs this site called the Tennessee Holler, which is like a network of social media pages that just generates fear porn for progressive people. From what I can tell, both inside and outside of the state, it's kind of like if you're a blue state person that just wants to get jacked up on activism and get the feeling that you're fighting the power. You tune in to the Tennessee Holler, and I've taken him to task for multiple things. This is one of those organizations that thrives on tragedy, something that I've deliberately tried not to do, in many ways to a detriment, but I won't get into details. But following the Covenant tragedy, there were many opportunities to capitalize on this event, and we ultimately tried to play in a more even hand. In the aftermath of that, the Tennessee Holler, however, gained 50,000 followers, a 45% increase from their previous following, And, they kind of rely on events like this happening to get a following. Their motto is always yell the truth, but at one point in the article, Canoe calls objectivity a myth. This is in the Nashville Scene cover story. It's the kind of self-justification that a sleazy marketing executive might say to justify targeting children with sex change operations or some other such thing. It's this language, like a journalist or an activist or this kind of thing whose motto is always yell the truth, saying that objectivity is a myth, kind of undermines your entire credibility, in my opinion. Yeah, he's been effective at getting eyeballs on certain topics. He lives in a very red state, and if you live in a red state and you're a committed, dyed-in-the-wool Democrat, it's very easy to find boogeymen to fight against. He thrives in this environment. It's not likely that this guy would do very well in his home state of California, where he came from and ran for Congress within a year of moving here. Like the definition of a carpetbagger. Was going around telling people that Marsha Blackburn was, this or that. Kind of the exact type of person that you don't want moving to this state, a transplant, not a refugee. So it's ironic, of course. He doesn't believe in objectivity. The Holler's motto is always yell the truth. But I mean, maybe he's right. Maybe the standard of objectivity is impossible. And so why even bother? Why even try to be objective or accurate or sensible? Why even try to give people something that they can utilize themselves? Why not just, the inequities are so abound that it seems impossible to maintain a clear head and be objective in this time. That would be his conceit. Well, I had this graph. I forgot I had it up. This is like the Tennessee Hollers following. April 5th was the week when Justin Pearson and Justin Jones got ejected, and they kind of jumped in as the creme de, I don't know. They're like the boots on the ground for this tragedy of democracy. I could talk a lot about Justin Canoe. He's been something of a thorn in the side of pretty much everyone in local media. Holly McCall was one of the co-founders of the Tennessee Holler, and even in the article you see them kind of struggling to grapple with his tactics. They're really reminiscent of what the alt-right was doing in 2016 in the lead up to Trump's election. This kind of like in-your-face style of politics that if you watched the show last week, Jim Cooper was complaining about, with the classic anecdote of his plumber wearing a "fuck Joe Biden, oh, well, let's go Brandon" hat. He translated it in the quote, but he's utilizing these tactics that have been used, that are routinely used to dismiss figures on the right. Like if he were on the right, and this is not like the standard, well, it kind of is actually. Democrats are hypocrites, I guess is what it is. But if you were on the right, he would be roundly condemned as a grifter, even by people on the right. They would probably call him a grifter. But because he's masking his activism in establishment policy ideas and establishment politics, instead of being a martyr or instead of being a grifter, he's celebrated as a martyr and a hero. And that's a dynamic you see at play. It's much different for when we're covering city politics, the Pamphleteer, it's much easier for us to find boogeymen because the city's very progressive. It just elected its most progressive city government in its history. So, in the city, we're in kind of a similar position to Canoe is with the state. He just goes about it a little differently than we do. We're still waiting on Lafayette to join. We're going to talk about the border whenever he does join. What else can we talk about here? Let me see something. Oh, another thing. I'll just say this to Jared. Will talk about this on Friday, but I think it's worth noting that I'm going to share my screen real fast. So this great movie, Surprised by Oxford, which is playing tonight and Sunday in Nashville, is by a Franklin-based filmmaker, Ryan Whitaker. I would highly suggest going to see it. Let's see what the screen times are. Oops, that's the trailer. I might have gone to see it tonight were I not doing this show. So next time, if you didn't catch it Monday or today, you can catch it Sunday. Here looks like it's playing in the afternoon. Green Hills, Bellevue, Hendersonville, Mount Juliet, Franklin, around the Middle Tennessee area. Jared had a lot of very positive things to say about it. Ryan is working on the new Daily Wire series, the Pendragon Cycle, I think it's called, this like fantasy series, and he's in Hungary right now working on that. So he's tied in with them, and Jared also wrote this great article about him. Let's see, post. About him and a number of other Franklin filmmakers earlier this year. Franklin's surprisingly got, a fairly established film scene that's developed a nice niche outside of Hollywood. So both these articles I'll put in the show notes. They're worth checking out. And if you can, I hear on good word from our resident film critic that Surprised by Oxford is worth your time. So be sure to check that out. Let's queue up our immigration chat here. Some of the other, what did I see today? Well, there were some videos of migrants crawling under the fence along the border. Someone, I think a Venezuelan mother had her child and was using cardboard to keep them away from the barbed wire. And when you see clips like that, it's pretty infuriating trying to imagine, first of all, the conditions that led to that person to get there. Are they as desperate as they seem? Clearly they must be. And it's kind of a delicate matter. It's difficult to talk about matters of immigration without getting inflamed. I find it difficult. I see that Lafayette has just popped into the chat. We're going to invite him up here, whether he's ready or not. Hey, Lafayette, how are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Good. So I was just talking about, broadly the situation at the border. There's been a lot of, I don't know, headlines and information. Not a lot of it's very, I don't know, it's not surprising at this point, but has anything stuck out to you uniquely of late regarding all that?
Yeah, I've been watching it for a while now, and I think something I wrote about this a little bit, but I think something to focus on is we're seeing a lot of these busloads of immigrants and flights. We've seen some information about chartered flights for, last number I saw, and I needed to verify, but I saw somebody say that about 200,000 people had been flown around the country. So I wanted to vet that out a little bit. I haven't had much of a chance to dig into it, but point being is we're seeing a lot of these people end up in every corner of the United States. And I think the important thing to keep in mind is sometimes it feels like finally this issue is hitting critical mass, and that, maybe the governor of New York or like the mayor of Chicago or New York City, that they'll rethink their position on immigration, that they'll finally crack down like we want to see. And I think what we're learning is that this issue is one of those that even what might feel like a win is really a loss, and that this will be spun up into what they always do, which is let's turn this into an issue by which we can force amnesty, by which we can build out our patronage network, we can ask for more money. And so sometimes, people on the right will see this and they'll hope that these mayors or these governors will start seeing the nation as a nation again, that they'll be team players, that will understand that this is that maybe it's just a problem of ignorance. But in reality, what we're seeing is we're just seeing how this will turn into a win. It will galvanize the left rather than take them down a peg.
That's an interesting point. I'm thinking specifically of Eric Adams' reaction, which, in a way was like heartening to hear him express how big of a problem it is. But you're right in that it's not going to fundamentally alter his worldview. Their worldview is going to remain unchanged. They'll package it through that lens and, maybe use it as leverage for amnesty or some other such thing. I'd not considered that, because I was kind of like, I don't know, somewhat hopeful about Eric Adams' reaction to it, thinking that kind of posture towards it might spread. But then you see them putting them up in hotels and, talking about how they need to build out billions of dollars of infrastructure to deal with them, slashing the budget of the MNPD to do it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, that whole never let a crisis go to waste, Eric Holder's like famous statement. This is just really true. And I think for listeners, people within our sphere, regular, ordinary people who are just decent people who feel an attachment to their place and to their communities and their sense of nation, I think we have to understand that most people in the political class just do not feel any of those things. They don't see this the way that we do. So when we see images of our borders being overrun, we are citizens. So we look at these issues through the lens of citizenship, of keeping laws and protecting our communities from crime and being able to make sure that these services, right, critical services, that they work well for the citizens of this, like all of these priorities that we have, this is just not shared by the political class at all. And that's the hardest part, is most of the reactions have always been like, it must be ignorance, this must be maybe the mayor just doesn't understand. And I caution people against that. I mean, I appreciate people giving our political leaders the benefit of the doubt in some ways. You're hoping, you're really trying to give them the benefit of the doubt. But in reality, like, they just don't see things this way at all. Crises are its currency for a regime like this, whether it's a mayor or a governor. This is, a good way to look at this too, is like the idea of endless war. Endless war is not an accident, right? This is the lifeblood of a political system like this. So for the same reasons why something like a crisis abroad or terrorism or something like that is perceived as a national crisis, this only serves to enrich and enlarge this same political class. And so immigration is really no different. A crisis is a good thing. I think they see it. And it forces it forces a political capitulation, right, from people, where it gets to such an unsustainable point that what would have been an untenable compromise 10 years ago is now the only option on the table, right? And this is just how these folks operate.
I talked about this at the top of the show. I don't know if you saw that the German family seeking asylum in East Tennessee. They've been here for 15 years, and now they're being threatened with deportation. So I tweeted out about that. I had Cato Institute people in my replies, and a couple of others, talking about the particulars of immigration law. And what I was trying to get across is that their whole like needly argument with me was that if they granted asylum to this family, it would set a precedent whereby you would have to justify all asylum seekers or something like that. And it feels like a lot of times when you talk to someone about immigration or something, they try to reduce it down to these very I don't know, like it's a matter of law, or it's an economic concern, ignoring the cultural component of it. Is there any hope that you have for kind of a renewed sense of American culture and viewing immigration not through this like tersely legalistic jargon that do you see what I'm saying? Like, do you see that there being ever again a unified vision of America that could adequately speak against unimpeded immigration, or is this something that will just take pure political will?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, to address the first part of it with the Cato Institute and that whole sphere, it's really easy to just kind of foist the burden on a system. And we always say it's dysfunctional, it doesn't work.
Yes, right.
Absolutely, there's lots of red tape, there's lots of laws. But see, like this this is kind of the whole problem with the libertarian. One of the biggest problems with the way that the libertarians look at this issue is that, these laws and all these regulations and this, bloated bureaucracy that comes along with it, like they attack these things. But in reality, like what's behind that is power, and the way in which a regime like this and the way in which bureaucrats or political operatives can use regulations, that they can use the laws and massage it the way that they want, because there's not really much of a check on their power. There's not really a balance to this system. It's really antithesis of what a constitutional form of government would have been at our founding or even later. This is its own animal. And so, all that to say that it's very, somebody sitting on across the table from somebody who has the power to grant them a green card or citizenship or things like that. I mean, they can use a great deal of discretion. So I'm not entirely convinced that this is just a systemic problem alone. There are individuals who work within these institutions. There are reasons by which they can flex their power, whether it's personal and petty or whether they're actually doing something for a political end. The problem is the system's incomprehensible, and libertarians don't really have like an answer to this. Requires a cultural change, and it's not really just a cultural change on the part of Americans as citizens. Most Americans do not like seeing this. They don't like the way that this operates. So their will is not really being integrated into the system. It's not really it's not influencing the political class or this elite class of political operatives who really don't operate according to the consent of the governed. Where we need that cultural shift is at the top. That's the problem, is if there was political will at the top. And this is where Republicans get away with a lot, because in reality, it's not a priority for the Republican Party. Not at all.
No.
I mean, I think Trump's presidency, whether people like or dislike Trump, doesn't really matter. The thing is that Trump tried to put that in the forefront of his party as the leader of his party, and we saw what happened. I mean, it's just all this goes to show it's not a major priority for the Republican Party. This also serves their interests, and so really, what you have is the whole country could be polarized against this immigration system, the open borders. But until that changes at the top, until somebody who has the political power to flex a bureaucracy like we have now, unless that changes, this will continue on.
Christopher Caldwell had a really good long essay in First Things, I think last week, where he talks about, it's kind of an assessment of the 90s, and he talks about how the Clinton presidency was, you mentioned how government doesn't really reflect the will of the people anymore, and I'm sure this is probably something that's up for debate, but he makes the point that it was during the Clinton presidency that this relationship between the goals of politicians became less to reflect the will of the people and more to institute their programs and get their various initiatives done. And I thought that was an interesting point that kind of matches what you're saying. I mean, how do you even begin changing the culture at the top?
Yeah, great question. And I love that essay by Caldwell. One of the points he brings up that I think is important for us to look at, and there's historical roots to this. I like to go back to the 1930s is a good place to start, and where we really see a major sea change here, the way that we view government. But, that essay basically makes the case that we traded in the idea of let's reflect the consent of the people that we're here to represent too. Let's make sure government functions and functions well, and there's a major difference there, right?
Yes.
Is we want this machine to work is really the priority. And who determines what that machine is or where it goes? I mean, obviously, that has now been completely divorced from the public. So the public really has very little input. One other thing I'll add is I think it was from, I'm probably wrong, but I think it came from Yale. But there was a really interesting paper on this where they actually, there was a methodology and everything on trying to weigh out when it comes to the desires or interests of particular groups on who actually has the policy later on. So if let's say that, the American public feels strongly about a particular issue, how much influence does that have over policy outcomes? And they kind of divided this up into three different groups. It was, you have your voters, regular people, you had your economic interests. This would be like businesses, companies, and then you finally had special interest groups, NGOs, things like that. There was actually a complete, like, statistically, voters had like a 0%, like a zero influence over policy outcomes. It was, it couldn't even be measured. So it was so slight. And everything else divided up between economic interests and then your special interests. So that, all that to say is that this is really the political system we live under. You know, most of these, and I don't say this because I like it, right? I'm not celebrating this, but like, yes, we hold on to figures like George Washington. We talk about the Constitution. These really are more ceremonial garb for an operating system that calls itself a democracy or democratic government. It is not that. And so, to answer your question finally, with all the setup there, is just, you know, how do you go about doing this? And this is where the key, it's really key. Getting like a large peasant revolt will shake things up. I would argue that like the MAGA movement, Trump, this did shake things up. It did a lot to expose the fraud that that kind of has been allowed to exist in our political system for too long. But peasant revolts don't really go anywhere. That's the problem. What you really need is you need a change with elites. And this is why we have to be careful when we think that just exiting the system, you know, living off the grid proverbially, that this is going to like change everything, or that we're going to protect ourselves forever. This is kind of romantic idealism that we get from like a frontier society. We don't really have a luxury. What we really need is we need motivated, capable, competent people to find their ways into places that have influence and power, and really try to exert that political will there. And they have to do that in a way that's more intelligent. It can't be guns a-blazing. You know, you can't be telegraphing everything you're attempting to do. The reason why our institutions have completely capitulated to the left is because they did this. They did this for half a century, if not more. And so we need to have a different viewpoint here. It's not about whipping up the masses alone. It's really about finding capable, competent individuals to be able to find themselves in the right places and exert their will in those places where really they have more influence than they would as just like a diluted voter.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting you bring up the off the grid stuff. I talked about that with my guest last week, because it is unique to the frontier spirit to want to like just escape to the woods. I don't think many other nations or peoples on planet Earth have that. I even feel the pull within myself, you know, even though I don't think I'll ever act upon it, but you know, it's a very American thing. How did you end up that quick? What, I had something in mind. I just got distracted talking about frontier culture. So finding capable, competent people, I'll say, you know, locally in Nashville, one thing that, you know, when you set out to get involved in some system or, you know, I don't know, enter into local politics in my case, you often don't realize what you're up against. And like every city has its own little swamp. And Nashville is no different. I mean, we just elected, you know, the most progressive metro government in the city's history, and only like, you know, 12-15% of the people turn out to vote in the city. So it's like, you know, the person that wins the mayor's race gets like 60,000 votes, in this instance the loser got 40,000. So you don't have a whole lot of civic engagement. And what I've tried to do is try to promote, you know, a more active civic engagement on a granular level. I think it feels to me like over time, I don't know what kind of dulled that impulse, which is also very American, this like desire to be an active participant in government. I think it's kind of like the you know, it's the uniquely American creative outlet is politics, in particular local politics. I didn't know if you had any thoughts or insight as to why we've seen that kind of impulse get whittled down to an edge, especially on the right. And I do have, you know, you could say that it has to do with the Republican Party demonizing government in general, saying that the media is bad, academia is bad, basically demonizing all these paths that might enable one to get into these situations of influence. So yeah, I was wondering what you think has happened there.
Yeah, that's been a really difficult. It's been a challenging thing for us on the right because here's the problem: like the way the landscape is, people of our political persuasion have an advantage at the local level. We really do. These levers of power, like the at the ground level, we have the most influence over this small political system that we have. This is all left over from the founding. I mean, this is old stuff. Some of these institutions in your backyard have been around since before the country was there, right? Local
Right.
sheriffs. I mean, this is the oldest political office in the country. We still have those. They wield an incredible amount of power over their local counties or wherever, townships, things like that. We have this advantage here. It's harder for NGOs and this big progressive blob to wield its weight against rank and file regular people close to the ground in most of these places. It's too much, it's too expensive to try to twist something up. It's not worth it, right? But see, to us, when we live in a town or a city that we love, we are motivated by a desire to improve the place that we know best. We know the people that we live around. This is just basic stuff. And the problem is that we have changed culturally in this idea of like having a government system that works, right? That Caldwell talks about. This was not just a democratic, point of view. This has influenced conservatives and Republicans also. And so we're working against ourselves when we do this game where we're always distracted by the Washington circus. Like, I don't understand this. And I mean, we've all fallen into this trap. So I'm not trying to be harsh with folks, but, you know, I don't understand how I can talk to somebody who might be on the right and they're saying how corrupt the system is, how corrupt the media is. We're up against all these NGOs and we're up against all the, this election rigging and all so on and so forth. But I can't get these people to go to the one place, show up to the one, school board meeting or a small election, which if they just get their neighborhood to come out and vote, they can swing an election.
Oh yeah.
I can't get any movement there, but I can, it's always like, well, we just got to try harder at the national level. Like we got to really speak out. And this is kind of goes back to that idea of that peasant politics stuff that I think is really bad. It's not American. I mean, this is not culturally, like you said, we've always been very political, but at the local ground level, place matters. The people that we care about in our community, like this is where the rhetoric doesn't work. If the guy down the street is a scumbag and he doesn't care about the people in the community, he has a bad reputation, he can say whatever he wants, folks already know. But, if he goes to the national level, he can lie through his teeth. People get, obviously people will get deceived. Point being is look at all the leverage you have at this local area. We have got to reroute ourselves in our local communities, our towns. And I'm not talking like, even if, let's say you live in a big liberal city, you might not be able to swing the mayoral election, right? But man, your neighborhood and the precinct you live in, that's ripe for the picking. Like you really do have a lot of leverage, even if it's within your neighborhood. And this doesn't have to start on like some grand scheme level. Have people over, like at least where I'm at, we have pie on our porches every at least once a month. We talk about all sorts of things. Right there's a touch point with people that see things at least somewhat similar. They know me. I know their families. We are creating a small polity, right? This is how we should look at politics. We've really got to kind of get away from the reality television circus stuff, because all it does is it just takes our money, our time, and we get such little back. When in reality, like if we could see ourselves as a polity the way that our ancestors did, the founders did, I really think we'd be able to flex more leverage over our local areas and get more done.
Do you think it's as simple as TV and just the kind of nationalization of every single political concern as communication mediums kind of
Absolutely.
consolidated. It seems like it's really as simple as that. I think that like stole the impulse.
No, I think you're totally right about this, and this is why I love what you're doing. By the way, is just it's interesting because when we find ourselves in this highly propagandized environment, media landscape, it's just completely saturated, right? Um, look at how propaganda works. I could be on Twitter or another platform, or I'm watching Fox News, right? Notice it's not about what like they're not necessarily always trying to convince you. Look at the way in which your mind is molded by what is addressed. Think about the topics that are allowed to exist in a seemingly free-flowing discussion, and then what doesn't ever enter that discussion. See, that's where, to me, if you want to understand propaganda, that's how you have to start looking at it. Interesting, I could be, I'm over here in a neighboring state to you. Half of the things that I hear about on Twitter, for example, have no relevance to my life at all,
Yeah,
right?
correct.
Be on an open platform in this open ocean, right? I'm a small coral creature, like living in a reef, but I have to have a position on something that has to relate to everything else in that ocean, right? So what ends up happening is I now have to have a position on these obscure issues. I now have to have a position on a policy that affects New York. I have to have a position on something that affects Tunisia, right? These things all become of the utmost importance. And meanwhile, like, what are the issues we're talking about in my local neighborhood, in my local town? Well, I'll tell you, the people that are talking about those issues, that are focusing on those issues, half the time they meet such little resistance that they're just winning over
Oh yeah.
right? And so this is why propaganda is dangerous, is because it's not just about convincing you on something. It's about narrowing your scope or broadening it to such a point that whatever you think or do has really no bearing on the reality that you're living in.
Yeah. You even see it even trickles down into local media. I mean, Nashville's a fairly big city. We got quite a few local publications, and they're all kind of in lockstep. And it's not like you have this, the master hand manipulating them and telling them what to say on particular issues. But they're all ideologically aligned, and they all ultimately get their marching orders from, other liberal or Democrat favoring media outlets nationally. You don't see that like like the guy that just won mayor here didn't run a campaign where he kind of like in a coded way demonized Republicans. It was like a dog whistle of sorts, billionaires and bachelorettes, which was like the tourists, and the tourists in Nashville are mostly, Southern affected. I would assume that most of them probably vote for Trump. I mean, country music is probably the only creative industry in the country that has a right wing affectation to it, and everyone knows that. So it's just interesting how like all that interplays. The local media is not immune to this as much as people would like to think. Like you got, there's a paper here called the Nashville Banner that just started up, and the Banner used to be the Republican version. Back when you had two dailies. And now, they're a nonprofit, purportedly nonpartisan race or publication. And, they didn't publish a single critical article or essay or point of view of Freddie O'Connell, who won the mayor's race, at all throughout the entire race until 2 days before the election. They published his donations and revealed that like 1 in every 4 of Freddie's dollars, who was understood as this kind of like grassroots for the people candidate, came from PACs, NGOs, and LLCs, which revealed him to be more, kind of in the pocket of businessmen and entrenched interests than he would have liked to say. And that's like, that's another, it's kind of like propaganda also just works by omission, not showing you this side of the thing, and people will buy the bait that you're nonpartisan. I've never, I don't know. I don't think that, I think that like in media, objectivity is something you should seek, strive for. Like, of course I want to be correct and I want to make a valid point, and I also want to be persuasive in the way that I present it. But I don't think that it's possible to like not be biased. And I think it's very dishonest of media, and I'm thinking in particular local media, to not acknowledge that there's some bias built in. And when you call them out on it, they have little hissy fits. I mean, it's unreal.
Yeah, no, Well, and it's kind of what's really interesting about the environment that we live in is that, there's absolute coordination, especially at the national level. Like when you have, like, the only way that if you're going to get like, hot takes coming right out of the bureaucracy, you have to have access and relationships. So like, obviously there's going to be levels of coordination here. The DNC is going to launder information through the media. So is the national security state, if they want to get a war on the docket, this is how it all works. But, what's interesting too, though, is that because, and this is a strength and a weakness, because the left is now, they control most public and private institutions, right? And they also have that level of prestige. People on our side of the fence we have that stank about us that we are like low class, that we're rubes, or that we're unsophisticated. That all that cultural baggage that comes along with it. That's what we're always associated with. And so even aspirant journalists, like if they're in Nashville and they want to make it up to like the New York Times, or that's their dream, how are they going to operate? How are they going to write? So they might not be getting marching orders always. It's that they know at a subconscious level, they know exactly the kind of work they should be doing. And this is where the weakness is, though, is it's not authentic. It's fake. It's fraudulent. It's a counterfeit. They're not doing what they say they're supposed to do. It's a game. But see, this is where our side, I think, could make up ground. And this is what I like what you're doing. Like, why we have an advantage where we have the ability to be authentic and true. When we're authentic and true, they can't do that, right? But we don't have to be that way. And this is where I think we could make up a lot of ground by not trying to ape what the left is doing when it comes to this kind of a thing, when it comes to creativity, when it comes to art, when it comes to music, when it comes to the written word, the spoken word. We have the ability, the flexibility to be creative, to be authentic, to be true. That is where we should be focusing most of our efforts, rather than trying to ape what they're doing, because we really have nowhere to go. Like the New York Times isn't going to hire you if you're a journalist, right? And your music, let's say, like the musicians out there, okay, you're not going to get signed on to some big label unless you sell out. You got to sell your soul. But man, there's all this room out there where there's such an appetite for authenticity, for truth. It's just not there. But man, like, think about if you had a bigger vision about being a creator, about making a real difference. I mean, there's so much fertile ground to work with. And I think if we on the right can change our mind, it's a little bit, stop trying to chase after the left's prestige, but try to create and cultivate our own, I think we're going to be leaps and bounds ahead of where we are today.
Yeah, I think the prestige trap is an interesting one. And just, I've worked in the entertainment, and I've done, I've witnessed this kind of like the lure of all that stuff. And one person that sticks out to me recently is Zach Bryan, who kind of, I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's kind of, it's not my type of music, to be honest with you, but I don't know. I'm always kind of looking into, I track these things, right? It's my job. And like one thing you notice with him is he's built his persona on being authentic, but you can even tell that as he's ascended, he's had to pay homage to like various kind of liberal pablum, and he'll do it. He's not willing to torch his success to like stand up to any of these things. And on the one hand, I frankly understand that. Like, I understand how tempting it must be to get to that point, and then to have to all of a sudden do an about face and start, refuting things. He's probably not even intellectually prepared to do that. So like part of the, I think a lot of the problem there is just the, like in Rome, the artists were slaves. If you don't have this like cultural political apparatus that protects people like that, then there's no way for them to ever get to a point where they can even succeed on a serious level and have like real clout. But yeah.
It's interesting you bring that up, because I also think, because I think we have the ability to be authentic, that are, even established, talented people are still restrained in ways that we are not.
Yeah.
Right. I still see that if we could expand our vision a little bit, artists out there, creators, people that are trying to speak to truths that are real and matter to people, that matter to them, really try to sing to the soul. I just see that we have so much ability to do that because, we have all this flexibility. We have an environment that is hungry for it, right?
Oh, yeah.
But I think that we have to be willing to cultivate our own kind of prestige. And I'd just go with this is like, a good example would probably be, there's musicians and artists out there that I think are truly great. And a lot of them got to the point where they love to make people happy, and they love to speak to people in a real way. And I think that was a huge thing. But they also understood that they had a real love and devotion to their craft. And that kind of thing speaks to people. It breaks through these barriers. And we see it from time to time. And that like where you get breakthrough, and I mean authentically breakthrough, which is very hard because it's always artificial these days. But there, once in a while, you'll get that person. You'll get a writer who writes something that just breaks all those barriers down. See, this is the stuff that we can do, and I think that young people out there, young guys, maybe you don't even have to call yourself a right winger, right? I just use that because,
yeah.
But like, let's be honest, like this soul sucking operating system, this artificial phony nonsense that we, all this, the phony morality, the pageantry, all that stuff, it grates on the soul. And people that at least want to create something true, that they want to push back against that, to recapture, restore their sense of humanity, humility, piety, all these things that we miss and we lack here. I feel like there could be a culture of resistance to this fake, nonsense that we have to deal with all day, day in and day out. And that really, there's no better time, especially for a young guy out there. I don't know. I don't know. I have big dreams for our side of the fence. I hope that we can just have the courage to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Even working grunt jobs in Hollywood is grating. I mean, like, so it's not just for people that make it to success. If you're in any industry, you've probably experienced this in your life at some point. Like you're working in any industry where the people that you're working with require you to have these views to basically fit in and succeed. I mean, it's you just got to find the people that align with you to work with, or go to a place or a career that has more of those people. And I think that's like generally what I've tried to do, even though I'm now in probably the most hostile profession there is. Well, hey, okay. So you mentioned you have a somewhat of a background in foreign policy. This is kind of a throwback to how we started this conversation, but it's on my mind because I was just thinking about how foreign policy affects migration patterns. And what, like one of the big, I saw this argument today in regards to funding the Ukrainian war and ensuring that it came to, an equitable end, or whatever they're saying now, with Ukraine taking back, all the land it had prior to 2014. They're saying that this is a way to prevent, refugees coming from Ukraine, etc. And frankly, I'm somewhat sympathetic to the argument that if there is a foreign policy mission for the U.S., it should be to stabilize the globe in order to ensure that people don't have to flood across the border or into Europe, etc. I didn't know if you had kind of a big foreign policy vision or idea for how the U.S. should approach foreign policy, if at all.
Yeah, we're living in an exciting time where we're seeing big changes across the board. And really the United States is having to the incoherence that we see from the foreign policy establishment in Washington is that the world is changing in a way that they are not. I don't think that I really, there's a lot of competent people, as misguided as they may be. There are competent people in Washington. There are very intelligent people, but the problem is that the world is now changing in a way that I even competent diplomats and so on, they're going to have a very hard time adapting to the way these macro trends that we're seeing. One of those being like, the problems going on with China right now. And we just saw a paper come out from a war college, I believe, or it might have been just straight from the Pentagon. I'd have to look at that, but talking about the potential of having a draft if we have to go to war with China, right? And I think China definitely. I think war is always on the table for China, especially as it gets more desperate for China. But like we have to understand, like one of the big things that has really kind of flown under the radar for a lot of the public discourse that we have is that China's in really bad sorts right now, right? That we're seeing a loss, a significant loss of capital and a drop in exports, which those two things, that's just like the lifeblood of the Chinese economy. And there's a political problem on top of that, which is exacerbated by these trends, right? Only reason I bring that up is that, the trend is that this capital is redirecting. It's being sent to Europe and to Latin America. This is a power shift. We're also seeing a shift internally where we're seeing a lot of that capital bleed out of places like New York and California and end up in places like Texas, Florida, Tennessee, right? We're seeing a major shift there too. This will change all sorts of things. I mean, this will have major impact on our country and the rest of the world. Like globalization as we knew it, and when we were young coming up, it's never going back to being like that. It's changing now. And part of this is those who are young and hungry and want to get in on the ground floor. I mean, this is the time, if you have an interest in any of these things, to jump into it, because I'm telling you, these trends are going to change the landscape significantly. Like trade between Latin America and the United States. Mexican labor right now is cheaper in manufacturing, is cheaper than Chinese. These are huge things. And so foreign policy wise, I think that our foreign policy establishment's holding on to what they know best, and they're just not able to confront the world that we live in. These are not as serious people as the Cold Warriors that they descend from. The world is changing too rapidly, I think, for them to be able to adapt to it. So they're obviously going all in on things like Ukraine. But all of these, for the last 20 years, we've seen a lot of destabilization campaigns, interventions abroad that have just destabilized entire regions and have added so many pressures to places like Europe and the United States. A lot of these, obviously, climate change is going to be the fake narrative that they're going to peddle out to try to explain why all these things are happening. But there are, obviously, war and economic shifts like we're talking about. These things all have an impact. And so, the United States can try to manage this as best they can. I just don't think that we have the ability to control this like we think we do. And I think that it will come back and bite us. I think the Ukraine war is going to have ramifications that will go on for generations, long after we're gone. It's just funny when people think that you can just do a knockout punch. Let's say that you could, topple the Russian regime. What you're doing is you're creating a giant unstable region that is full of weapons. I mean, that alone right there, and I just don't think that our foreign policy establishment doesn't really have skin in the game. So they don't really suffer the consequences for these things. They'll have a huge impact on the rest of the world. So sorry for the long rambling monologue, but the point I'm bringing up is that, I think the United States has been trying to adapt to this changing landscape. There's desperation. I think our elites and the foreign policy establishment is desperate, and they're desperate because this is just all coming too fast. For us, regular people, I think we need to open up we really need to change our aperture a little bit. I think we need to look to, the Monroe Doctrine, Western Hemisphere is going to come back into play and being a really significant region, North America, South America, Central America. I really think that's where the action's going to be. I think that's actually, as bad as things are right now, I think it's going to open up a lot of great opportunities. It's going to change the South in a lot of ways, good and bad. There's a double-edged sword there. It's going to bring in lots of money. It's going to bring in a lot of opportunity. But that means that you need to have a strong political system to weather the rapid change, right? To keep and retain your way of life and the political system that you have. And that's where that localism is just so important. So I think localism, as it's always been important, but it's more important now than it's ever been in our lifetimes.
Yeah, I agree 110% with that last point. Tennessee is doing this thing where I think we talked about this earlier today, actually, exploring turning down 1 billion some odd dollars in federal funds, purely so that they can manage it themselves. And I would imagine that they might be able to do it more efficiently and cheaper. And of course, that's, caused a lot of flame ups. But that, to me, is honestly, I think, one of the more interesting political developments that, aside from electoral politics, but as in terms of like states versus the federal government, that idea of states pulling away from the federal government is very compelling. And I think that, I don't know if it's just hollow posturing, because everyone in the Republican Party in the state of Tennessee talks shit about the Department of Education all day long. Like it's pretty accepted that the Department of Education needs to be eradicated. And that's like just basically Republican pablum at this point. So it could be just pandering to the base. I don't know. We'll see. It's exciting nonetheless.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I didn't mean to
continue. No.
I'll make it quick. I'll just say I think that is very interesting. And I mean, really, this is going to come down to this. I think on the elite level, if the entrenched elites that and see what's happening right now in Washington is there will be changes of the guard with factions within Washington winning out over others. Consider the transition between a Bush and an Obama, right? This is where you have two factions that are aligned on many issues, and that's why we're seeing them coalesce against somebody like Trump. But these factions do have interests. They do have clients, right? And they have patrons and all this. Thing is that if this crew gets to be too much of a liability, that you are going to see where a new elite faction could be ascendant, that they'll be able to garner more power and more influence. And this is why the states, it's really important, is we do need a strong, viable counter elite within the states. Yeah. Because the question will come down to, what does Tennessee want? Do Tennesseans want to be wealthy and have, cool gadgets and trolleys driving around in their cities, or, community
bike lanes,
but at the expense of being Tennessee anymore, of having their freedoms, of retaining any semblance to what came before, of being able to actually have the consent of the governed, apply to their politics? If the answer is I want more freedom than I want that, then the time is now to get that viable counter elite to wield its influence in Tennessee. And then if you can lock down Tennessee, that's when you can obviously coordinate things with other states nearby, right? That's where we should be aiming our vision. Ascendant, aspirant elites, that's where we should be looking.
Yeah. I think DeSantis could theoretically be that. I just don't think that he grew up observing, seeing the way the country going the way that we have. And so I don't know that he has that insight, even though he's been very effective in Florida doing, like kind of chartering an alternative course or a future for how states can crack down a lot of the insanity. But he's getting walloped by Trump in the primary. I think they're debating right now, actually.
Yeah, I know I was looking at that. Some people were messaging me, but I do think, in terms of Trump, like nationally, and I'll just say this is how I'm looking at it. I'll probably vote for Trump, I mean, if he's the nominee, absolutely. Right. But
yeah,
even if he's not, to me, the vote at that level has such like little impact. And I hate saying that because people are going to get mad at me and be like, oh, don't demoralize people. Demoralize people. But let's be honest, like when I vote for Trump, who am I voting for. I'm really voting against the injustice. I'm voting against the system that, whether or not Trump has policies people like I think people need to realize this is an example of the system chipping away more at your consent, being part of this political system, getting away with upending what's left of our constitutional order. To me, the vote at this point has entered the realm of symbolism. So this is a symbolic vote for me. And even if he loses, I'll be damned if I'm going to vote for somebody else that would essentially dignify what has happened. So I think that this will be an important election at the very least, because we really can't go away quietly into the night with what has happened. At this point, it's not really even about Trump or DeSantis. It is about this system flexing on populism, flexing on the American people, flexing on all these things they purport to protect, like the consent of the governed, right? And so for me at this point, it's, I'm kind of I really don't really care about other candidates. For me, it's just, I know Trump's the big enemy, so I'm happy to throw my vote his way.
I agree with that. Hold on, sorry, I'm putting up a little banner. Lafayette, thanks a lot for chatting. Hold on, I'm trying to put up your Twitter handle so that people can see it. Partisan O, add banner. There we go. If y'all want to follow Lafayette on Twitter, he's at Partisan O. You also have a Substack, I know, and you're working on that series of essays on Apocalypse Now, which is just one of my absolute favorite movies. So yeah, follow Lafayette on Twitter at Partisan O. Lafayette, thanks a lot for coming on. Pleasure chatting with you. Hope you have a good rest of your night.
Yeah, thank you so much. I enjoyed it. Have a good night.
Of course. All right. Well, that's our show for tonight, ladies and gentlemen. If you want to follow Lafayette Lee, like I said, Partisan O on Twitter. Sorry, I'm navigating around for these banners. Also, if you're not signed up for our daily newsletter, go to pamphleteer.co and sign up for that right there. Get on our date. We send out newsletters every single morning. I'm a maniac. So anyway, thanks for watching. We'll see y'all next week.